It is a great pleasure to introduce to our second speaker, Dr. Ghazla Jamil. And Dr. Ghazla Jamil holds a PhD in social work from University of Delhi. She is currently an assistant professor at Center for Study of Law and Governance, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Her research interests lie in the field of social development, social exclusion, urban governance, urban poverty, destitution and homelessness, social movements and protests, critical theory, post-colonial feminism, spatiality and materiality of culture. She has also published extensively on the theme of social exclusion and spatial segregation. She is the author of books Accumulation by Segregation, Muslims Locality in Delhi, and also Muslims Women Speak of Dreams and Shekels, published by Sage Publications. Today she'll bring us a short presentation on housing discrimination, ghettoization, and segregation, evaluating frames for the understanding specialization of identity in India. We are super excited to have you here and super excited to hear from you as well. Please take it.
Thank you so much. Very good evening to all the esteemed guests.
Mute.
Can you not hear me? I unmuted.
Yeah, we can hear. You guys probably have an issue with the speaker.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Okay. Shall I go ahead now?
Yeah.
Okay. So, so once again, a very good evening to all the research scholars and other students who have joined this session. Thank you to Professor Anu Sablok, Dr. Kanchan Gandhi, and all the other colleagues at IISER Mohali for their kind invitation to speak as part of this really exciting series, the Sheher Conversation. I love the name as well. As you know already the title of this talk that I'm going to give today, I will use this opportunity in part to recapitulate some of the main arguments in my project, Accumulation by Segregation, and assess, its potential and maybe, going further, share some of my forays in the matters related to and around the issue of segregation and how I've come to think of it, although I haven't, published any of those writings except for a book review or some such. This is the work or the continuing direction in which I'm thinking and working on a few papers. So just very preliminary thoughts that I'm trying to present to an audience which consists of peers, and I look forward to your comments and your critique. A set of dissatisfactions with the literature that concerns Muslims in India actually motivated me to embark on researching this topic. It was, as many of you might know, was my PhD dissertation. Apart from the very usual problems of representation, which I commonly understood as regards Muslims, there was also a problem of near total silence on Muslims and the scholarly literature on urbanization in India. And my dissatisfaction also arose from the fact that as a Muslim scholar, I struggled with literature that essentialized Muslims as subjects of research who would never wish to engage with what is written about them and use it for their own emancipation, in contrast with, let us say, feminist research, which explicitly is geared towards women's emancipation. So a lot of literature I found presented Muslims as victims of communal violence or described their problems and challenges. You've seen so many articles with that kind of title, Problems and Prospects, Problems and Challenges. But, the question before me was, what could you do with the theoretical framing which did not have any emancipatory vision? And my attempt was to actually produce a cogent and a structural explanation of what kind of forces and processes might be at work to produce the prevailing situation and which continue to resist efforts to change the situation. So even as I was very anxious about the criticism that the imperfection of my work would attract, because I was not really, my training was in social work, not a geographer, neither a sociologist, not a planner. So the anxiety was there, but I just decided to write a book that I wanted to read. So accumulation and segregation is essentially a record of my search for a theory that had emancipatory potential. And it was not my aim to even to begin with to establish any kind of irrefutable general causality through data. Rather, from the very beginning, mine was a limited but very decidedly a political project in which I have put forward some broad principles which might explain what maintains segregation. And my argument is that it is not merely violence or threat of violence that creates segregation, but that there is an implicit materialist logic in the prejudice and the segregation experienced by Muslims. The explanation that I'm forwarding also challenges the cliches about Muslim marginalization, and I assert that Muslim localities are not discrete economies, but segments that are networked and connected through controlled capital and production flows and labor mobilities geared towards capital accumulation in favor of other spaces in the city. This kind of adverse integration, and not marginalization, mind you, adverse integration in the globalized capitalist order through spatial segregation on communal lines is a form of spatial fix for imperfections of capitalism. The project of accumulation is not rational, as we know. Last to last year, that was the work on which the Nobel Prize on Economics actually went to, which showed that it is not, markets are not rational and impartial, but that this process involves differential treatment of people of different identities. And this differential treatment is contingent upon both overt violence. So I'm not saying that, violence doesn't matter, etc., and subtle coercion also through discourse, what is said about, people who bear a certain identity. And claims with that stereotype a minority also need to acquire facticity. If there was no, zero fact within those claims, who would believe them all the time? So there's something that needs to be done so that they can also claim, they can acquire some kind of fact, within those claims. And this I showed in my work that is done through repressive power of the state, which has also the power to conjure up self-fulfilling prophecies. So you first, label people that that's how they are, and then things actually start happening rather than the other way around. Many commentators ask me about whether the processes that I describe are also not reflective of the experiences of other communities of comparable social standing. So it's not something that's happening only to Muslims, it's happening to other people as well. And my response to that has been that I am not suggesting that the situation I describe is unique to Muslims or not experienced by any other community in India, but that I have said in the book that housing segregation on basis of identity is rather common in India. I mean, we all live separately, all communities. So it's not like Muslim localities are segregated and all other localities, everybody's mixed, well, they're not. Yet it has to be noted that the omission of Muslims from the urbanization literature and, all the work that happens on urbanization was rather stark. And except, when they made an appearance as victims of urban communal violence. In fact, it was my point of entry into this research that the processes characteristic of neoliberal globalization actually impinge on Muslim existence as much as they impinge on other communities. So why this discourse that Muslims are only impacted by Islam, that everything that happens to them is because of their Muslimness, and globalization, privatization, liberalization are never mentioned in discussions that are about Muslims. So yes, some of this stuff is happening to other people as well. but there are differences too. And on an ongoing subalternization of Muslims add this different element to their situation. For example, if you look closely, the spatial segregation of Dalits also follows more or less the same logic, which is that capitalism maintains the segregation mandated by caste prejudices. Yet the political strength of Dalit discourse cannot be matched by Muslims who, as I've tried to show in the book, have been reduced to being normatively non-citizens of India, like Agamben's homosecker who can be killed without invocation of the law. The inability of Muslims to counter this political discourse that paints them as fanatics and violent effectively produces a kind of political debilitation that is not experienced by other communities, including other minorities. The discursive weak positioning due to this historical and more recent phenomena limits the possibility of Muslims to come together in a political assembly, as we have seen, in Shaheen Bagh movement and so on, and their power to politically bargain in a way which is not experienced, as I said, by other minority communities as well. So to come to the main question that I'm trying to address or think about in this talk is that I have actually very explicitly resisted and critiqued the labeling of Muslim neighborhoods as ghettos in the book, and I've argued that other neighborhoods are also not mixed localities. So entire cities segregated on the lines of class and around regional and linguistic identities. If Okhla or Old Delhi or Selampur are ghettos, why is why are other localities not ghettos as well? Because everybody is living in segregated neighborhoods. So following Loy Wako, I argued against this kind of pejorative labeling by academics, which was not alert to this historical specificity of these neighborhoods, that is Muslim neighborhoods, and further the limited but defined network nature of Muslim neighborhoods and their diversity indicated to me another reason why they cannot be called ghettos, because ghettos were necessarily also cut off from social life of rest of the city and economic life of the rest of the city. So many middle class neighborhoods admittedly are pictures of civic neglect, but the residents may very well be able to afford many comforts that the market can buy. In the initial stages of my work, I actually tried to, and that paper is still online in a conference. The first writing that I put out, where I tried to build actually a typology of Muslim ghettos, and I did use the term ghetto, in that. And this was when I just started my field work, but I soon realized that similar productive and consumptive processes go on with different intensities in all the localities. And so this kind of typology wasn't really getting me anywhere. And then, I kind of gave up on that typology. But there may be city-specific differences, and I have, of course, refrained from asserting that my framing can be utilized in all other cities without any alteration. I'll give you just one example. For example, Lucknow and Delhi are actually, demographically very different cities, but also in their history of Islamicate culture and what is also called Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb in Urdu and Hindustani. They're there, but in terms of the continuity of this Islamic culture, or Islamicate culture rather, and this Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, you would see that that continuity is much more resilient in Lucknow than it is in Delhi, where there has been a very powerful effort on behalf of urban governance processes and institutions to wipe out this culture. And Lucknow, unlike Delhi, therefore, has not seen this kind of large-scale attempt to purge the city of its Muslim past or Muslimness through nationalist urbanization. And of course, now we are not just purging the Muslim past, we are also purging many other pasts as well in Delhi through this nationalist urbanization. But as you know, as I think more about it, I've come to identify several other problems with this term ghetto as a frame to understand interplay of spatiality and identity. The term ghetto works as blinkers, I believe, which makes the attention of scholars to focus on identity as a social psychological construct with hardly any space left for anything else. And it is, as I said, a pejorative term. It continues to be a pejorative term. And if we examine the question of what leads to a neighborhood being labeled as a ghetto, it is clear that what we have on our hands is a case of a phenomena impacting its study too. Let me give you a couple of parallels. For example, the nature of modern state is constantly evolving and it's difficult to pin down. And this actually, and political scientists have written about it, hampers a researcher's attempt to carry out deeply analytical study of the working of the state. Similarly, for example, if you look at communalism, the study of communalism in India has been actually mired in communal prejudices itself. A lot of authors have perpetuated communal attitudes in their studies, and myths have been perpetuated. In a more, familiar example, the study of women's rights has been a very long entangled in institutions and practices and attitudes that do nothing to help, women gain autonomy. So the term ghettoization fetishizes a place and it hides the adverse integration that I earlier mentioned of a locality into global production networks. It reifies stigmatization as merely a psychological prejudice. And to go even further, the term ghetto has long been reserved in India for Muslim localities. No other localities were called ghettos. Although now I see attempt by many Dalit scholars to also use this term as a conceptual category to analyze some of what they see in Dalit localities. But of course, for Muslim localities, many other pejorative terms are used, which I'd rather not, repeat here. So when I was doing my fieldwork and after numerous interviews and as I began writing my research, it became more and more apparent to me that spatial segregation of Muslims in India has a historically specific form, but nevertheless, it is a tool of dispossession in a very, David Harvey or Marxist kind of way. And dispossession, not just in a vulgar economic sense, but in a wider sense of being dispossessed of full humanity through discursive processes as well. And in my observation, the distinction between media, culture, or service/production kind of activities clearly appear to dissolve into industries with a singular project of profit accumulation through this mobilization of prejudices around identity. And the state and the market as two most overwhelming and entangled concentration of power unleashed these processes that aided this dispossession and maintained the segregation. So I've argued in the book, Accumulation by Segregation, that it is problematic to explain the violence and prejudice experienced differentially by different classes and different castes of Muslims solely to be reserved to be a result of interplay of religious identities or just prejudices because people hate each other and therefore violence or therefore they can't live together. Such explanations are often supplemented by invocation of lack of political will and abdication of responsibility by Indian state to its minority subjects. But the role played by process of global capitalism escapes scrutiny altogether. And my further contention is that identities are formulated in a process of ascription of labels via which the structures of power, which I said, for example, capital and state, which are not necessarily in my formulation very distinct or discrete entities, but there's an interplay between state and market as well, and various conflicts that reflect the broad structure of dominance in society. And all of this is scripted into identity. So identity is not just a psychological thing or a social label that is given to people, but all this content is scripted into identity and the everyday experience of identity. And world over, belligerent majorities are pushing persistent minorities to further social margins. Identities are a major tool for segmentation of labor and for commodification of culture of the minorities for consumption of power elites. These minorities are then left to cope with these pushes, whether they do it creatively or they do it abjectly. That is their problem. My attention during the fieldwork was also drawn to another aspect that I did not begin with. It was the aspect that of commodification of the cultural heritage of the social marginalized. I learned that in the globalized or networked local spaces, this process must also be seen as locations competing with each other for economic growth. And while mainstream discourse rightly or mistakenly sees this cultural marketization as promotion of cultural heritage or even of communal harmony or cultural tolerance, it is also a method of hiding the disparities in a process of creating an attractive image of a city to promote consumption and to commodify culture. With this backdrop, you can understand my dissatisfaction with housing discrimination framing. So I've dealt with ghettoization framing, but if this is the situation, what can the housing discrimination framing, help us with if my project was emancipatory, really? And, research articles that mostly I have read that use this framing usually are restricted to looking at rental housing, and that too as only a denial of residence in desired location. So people want to live somewhere and nobody is letting them, rent a house in that location. And in the journalistic accounts of rental housing discrimination, it is often presented as a very vexatious or humiliating kind of experience. And academics have, of course, probed this further with the help of theory of humiliation, which comes from, Dalit scholarship. Now, this framing or the housing discrimination framing usually neglects the dynamics of real estate markets. In even those studies that examine this aspect of real estate market, they also look at only rental housing and residential localities. Now, within this rubric, something like shelter rights for homeless or slum dwellers in cities, or right to decent housing in smaller cities, maybe not in metros, or even in metros, it appears to me that housing discrimination frame is not invoked because it is a norm to blame poor for their fate, and this, it's usually connected to identity in this policy formulation or judicial pronouncements. Also, you can't really, use this housing discrimination framing. It doesn't go too far. And here, what activists find useful is actually framing of justice or human rights and citizenship rights rather than housing discrimination when it comes to, poverty and housing rights. Now, on these counts, poverty or class positioning is given precedence even when specific housing provisions or affirmative action related to housing are made to reserve or to make specific housing, provisions for SCs and STs, which gives rise to another new kind of segregation. And I'm not going to go into that because, there's no time for me to go there. But the housing discrimination framing downplays or completely neglects land rights. And nobody talks of Muslims' land rights ever in this country, right? But not only land rights, but also habitat rights, which are not merely issues of class, but are also cultural rights, which are part of, the bigger human rights, rubric. and especially human cultural rights of minorities, which are the only thing that only place in the Constitution of India where the word minority is mentioned. So upon assessment, I find that housing discrimination framing falls short of enabling a robust juridico-economic or socio-cultural political critique because it's very limited in its formulation. I'll give you one example. In his article titled Urban Rental Housing Market, Caste and Religion Matters in Access, Sukhdev Thorat uses, this was published in 2018, or I think I got the year wrong, 2013 probably, uses very interesting methodology. I'm sorry for being confused about time. I think it was published a little after my article was published in EPW. This was also published in EPW. So what Professor Thorat does in this article is to set up a quasi-experiment where he produces robust data that evidences discrimination in rental housing. And he had actually used a similar kind of method to research discrimination in employment in another article and dealing with, Muslims and Dalit. And if you remember my formulation that I shared, just a little while ago, and you've read my paper, it follows that this kind of discrimination against Muslims and Dalits in rental markets works because of resultant segregation aids capital accumulation. And contrary to Professor Thorat's observation, I forwarded that efficient outcomes of market mechanisms that he found missing here are not missing. They are actually in operation in these cases of discrimination. So discrimination also happens because it is efficient for the market to make money that discrimination continues. And they're in operation all the time if we look beyond this immediate rental or real estate market, although I do agree with his policy formulation and the recommendation that he gave in the end. While doing my own research and subsequently thinking with many students and peers, and I taught a course for several years now on neoliberal urbanization, I realized that spatial analysis demands a focus on processes rather than creating or emphasizing categories. And I also strongly believe that methodological form of spatial analysis must take shape around philosophical and ideational core of a vision for a just society, in which actually most people experience capitalist development as destruction and progress is actually experienced as a regression for most of the population in our country. And this is true for populations around the world. And it was in this quest for a philosophical vision that my attention was drawn to how spatial forms observe or neglect these kind of norms. So it made me think about torture or concentration or refugee camps or army cantonments or gated enclaves or public housing blocks or slum and squatter settlements and even spaces like entertainment parks and luxury resorts and last but not the least university campuses, which can be discussed as illustration of processes of global gentrification and production of spaces of exception where different kinds, there are ways in which identity finds itself spatialized, or people bearers of certain kinds of identity find themselves segregated or deployed as workers in a certain way. So I deduce, therefore, that housing segregation and ghetto framing are inadequate to understand how identity is spatialized outside this predicament of residential discrimination. So I mean, this is not to say I don't have to say that, you know, yes, discrimination does exist, but sometimes, you know, for the sake of clarity, I think one should, so that there is no misreading. So I'm not saying that there is no discrimination or there is no housing discrimination, but that for scholars and researchers, what are the frames in which we can actually we can achieve more you know, sharp analysis of what we see right in front of our eyes when we go out and do our research. And as I've said, you know, the foremost advantage of using the concept segregation is that it enables examination of identity as inscribed into other forms of segmentation of space beyond housing and residence. And it allows one to look at how identity is a marker around which dispossession of, you know, the undesirable sections of society aids accumulation in favor of other spaces in the city. In a sense, I advocate for going beyond residential housing segregation, and I, you know, advocate for utilizing the frame of segregation to examine the segregation on basis of identity as actually a major feature or characteristic of Indian urbanisms. I don't have time to do that, but being a less loaded and a much broader concept, segregation, the concept of segregation or the segregation framing also allows us to see that segregation actually can also be protectionist and affirmative, and all forms of integration are not necessarily empowering. But elaborating on that would probably require, you know, another talk and perhaps another book. So I'll just stop here and maybe we can take a few questions and of course your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ghazla. We are open to the questions. I think it takes few minutes for everyone to just come up and process.
Also, Abhijit is joined, so maybe we can. Yeah, yes, please. And Shailja, एक बार अभिजीत को भी introduce कर देना. Like I think he's joined. I can see.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah.
Right.
Hello, hi everyone. Yeah, so I have joined, but I think we'll take Shivangi's question and then maybe.
Okay, all right.
Okay. Hi. Am I audible? Hello.
Yeah. Go ahead, Shivangi.
Yeah. Hi, Professor Jamil. I loved your talk, and like I have read your paper in EPW and, you know, quoted it extensively in my thesis. So thank you for this talk. I work on predictive policing technologies and how you know, these technologies kind of reiterate whom we already consider as Muslims. And I work on hotspot mapping as a tool of predictive policing, where, you know, you map crime on a map of Delhi and then kind of show that these are the criminal areas. And during my fieldwork, I kind of found that it was not the objective map that was producing the criminal areas, but the criminal areas was already in the minds of the police. I'm sorry, please, my daughter. Haan, beta. Like, you know, I just wanted to understand like what you would talk about, let's say these technologies of smart policing, smart city, facial recognition, you know, how are they contributing in, again, producing criminal areas, and especially like, you know, areas that are majority Muslim areas. They are supposedly, you know, understood as criminal areas before they're even mapped. So, you know, I just wanted to understand like how you would theorize this kind of framing that is being done, you know, and the police state and governance, and, you know, how they would kind of talk to each other in this. I hope my question is clear and not too weak. Thank you.
Do we want to take several questions together and then I should respond, or should I respond to Shivangi's?
Ma'am, you can answer Shivangi's as comfortable to you. Whatever is.
Yeah, because I tend to talk a lot, so therefore I was thinking if I took a few questions, then I could, you know.
Ma'am, in that case, can I ask a question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, good evening, ma'am. My name is Tayyaba. I am from JNU. Recently, I started getting involved in research around segregation of spaces within Delhi. Let's say segregation of urban spaces within Delhi. And my area of research has started with Old Delhi, how it has been fetishized, became a commodity and then consumed by people within Old Delhi and by people outside of Old Delhi. So my question is, here I was not interested only in the historic production of the spaces, but more in the emotional history of, let's say, what Old Delhi means to the people living there or people living outside. And the papers that I read, I felt like there's an understanding that Old Delhi is a place of nostalgia. For people within Old Delhi also, it's a place of nostalgia of a past that is not coming back. And for other people, it's a place of nostalgia as well, of like a general history. But like they consume Old Delhi differently. So I was just hoping if you have any say on that, how these segregated places come to be commoditized and how people living within that space associate with the space and how then it's consumed by them and other people. Like a lot of people in Old Delhi also, let's say Kareems, etc., they have followed this performative, they also play a very performative role, that we are from Old Delhi. Even when they have a stall at Delhi Haat, they would perform as if they belong to this place, and let's say with the banners, etc., they put minarets, etc. So it became, like in my research, I found that it had become a commodity. So how do you think different people associate with that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I've actually written an entire chapter on this in my book. I don't know, you might want to look at it.
Oh, that would be wonderful if I'll look at that. I'll look at that. Sorry, I didn't do my research before that.
Yeah. Right. So, so on to Shivangi's question. I mean, Shivangi, in the book, I've actually, discussed some of this idea, and in the talk earlier, I've just gestured towards this idea that stereotypes regarding Muslims, of course, there is a social angle to why the stereotypes are there or how they get perpetuated, but a very important angle to the perpetuation and continual circulation of these stereotypes is the state's role within it. And this whole idea of Muslim spaces as dark and criminal spaces actually is comes from policing practices and police's attitude towards it. So using several anecdotes, for example, I've used the anecdote of or the media, the way media and state agencies, policing and law enforcement agencies portrayed the Butler House encounter, and how that perpetuates. I've also looked at media and especially news media and Bollywood, the more popular media, on how these stereotypes are perpetuated. So the idea is not that, people think wrongly about them and it's completely false. But as I said, there's this self-fulfilling prophecy. So you first say, well, these people are fanatics because their religion is, like that, ABC. And then you actually use that to perpetuate some bit of that. A very good example of this I've discussed in detail in my book is the 2006 sealings in Delhi of commercial, entities within residential housing. So mixed land housing, and High Court, according to the High Court order, these had to be sealed. And then there were protracted protests across the city by Traders Association in Delhi against this order. And Dia Mehra has written a very intriguing article around it. It was also published in EPW before my research came out, and I've relied heavily on her work. Then, although the protests were happening everywhere in the city, and violent protests by Traders Association and workers who were mobilized by the Traders Association, but when there was a protest mobilized in Silampur, the police said that some people had thrown stones at them and they fired at the protesters. 4 people died. Firing did not happen in any of the protests across the city, even though they were more violent, like buses had been burnt and public property had been destroyed. Here only stone pelting was alleged, and then the firing happened. So, and if you read the article that was circulated, there was also this whole idea about police itself indulging in corrupt practices. And right in front of, there was this really funny anecdote, tragic funny anecdote that I found when I was doing my field work, of a guy who was sitting with a wad of notes in front, bang in front of the Silampur police station. And so I asked, people who were there with me, I asked, what is this guy doing? So they said, he's selling drugs. And he was sitting right in front of the police station, and all kinds of, youngsters who looked like they did not belong to that neighborhood, very well dressed, upper class youngsters were coming there and buying drugs in front of Silampur police station. But that, this kind of activity goes on right under their nose. Because, and this is what I call self-fulfilling prophecy. So they perpetuate this kind of behavior, and then they, stereotype. So, as far as more technological advanced ways in which this is perpetuated, as we have handle on more advanced technologies, Google Maps, for example, was once, several years ago, castigated by, not just in India, but in other places also. They had this option of avoid ghetto routes, right? So if you searched in Google Maps, the route for getting from point A to point B, and it passed through a certain African-American neighborhood, then you could also take another option, which was worked into the algorithm of this thing, where you could avoid going through a ghetto and circumvent a ghetto to take another route. So, technologies are not, necessarily innocent of human prejudices and all the other processes that go in social, dealings that people have with each other, and all the other social, political, juridical, economic, you name it. Everything is inscribed in technology itself. So we're seeing, the recent leaks from, Wikipedia, Facebook. You've seen, and the hearings that are happening by the woman whistleblower is it shows it pretty well what happens.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, and obviously I agree with you. Can I ask a follow-up question? Hello.
Yeah,
Hi,
sure.
I'll just ask, I think. So, I completely agree. Obviously, my research also shows that the prejudices are all there, and they're all, they're all reproduced in technology. I just wanted to understand whether, if you would, as an urban researcher, would feel that the kind of projects like Safe City or Smart City projects are essentially created so that, certain parts of the city are always segregated, because obviously they would create such data that would show those areas as criminal or unsafe. So, you know, they'll always be over policed, they'll always be segregated. They'll probably never get the kind of status that the posh areas would get. Just to maintain, like, you know, that kind of urban segregation setup that was always there, because it kind of helps everyone, right? From cheap labor to cheap economic activity and everything. Do you think, like, you know, these technological advances are also a way for the state to let the, you know, probably have an unending produce of labor and, you know, economic activity or something like that? Like, would you comment on that? Thank you.
I think the short answer to this is yes, you know, yes, I agree with you. So if there are no other questions, then I can maybe elaborate a little more.
Thanks. It'd be great if you could elaborate. I mean, I also know the answer is yes, but, you know, it's academic, so I might want to write about it. And that's why I would just want to understand, like, theoretically, how you would theorize something like this. Yeah.
We would like to introduce Abhijit Kapilesh first. I think then we can answer. Is it possible? Yeah. Abhijit. Hi. Hi.
Hello,
Yes.
hi, I'm Abhijit. I'm ADC in Fazilka and I'm commissioner in Abohar. And so as of this series, I'm a part of this enterprise to maybe bring together practice of administration and academia. And this is a very interesting series, the Sheher series that has been started. And the first, this is the second talk, and both the talks have opened up our minds. And essentially, I think that was the pedagogical sort of idea also, to open up our minds to see spaces in a new way. So from our own practice, from my bit of practice that we've done in this city, Abohar, there are, of course, not many Muslim families here, but we saw it in the context of Dalits. And while the word ghetto is in practice almost never used, we all use the word basti or something like that, nagri. But there is a slum area here composed mostly of Dalits. And when I visited it in the very starting, we saw that there were hundreds of kids, young adolescents who were roaming around on just one street. There's just only one big street, which leads to these smaller streets, which have these small houses and hutments and so on. And you know, there was, while kids were roaming around there, and some were also having a gala time, and some were maybe playing cricket and stuff like that. There were also in the same space people who were crying because they had consumed some kind of drug or something like that. Very close by was an illegal sort of Heka that was running, and of course, as you said, with the connivance of the state and so on. Everyone knew. I was right there, but I knew I couldn't do much about it. But the thing that happened is that we then planned to maybe make a space for them. And I mean, the question that came today is, like, how does the state respond to something like this? And we wanted to, I mean, this is a strange thing that happened, because I proposed that we make spaces for them to express themselves in ways other than roaming around on the street, which they had no other option but to do that, because that was the only open space there. So we proposed a small stadium there for kids who wanted to do something related to sports, right there, right in close to the slum or the ghetto or whatever you'd like to call it. I mean, just the basti. And then we proposed a community center for shadis and other functions and so on. And we also proposed a library. And then what happened is that there was this extreme, so I proposed the project to the government and we got the money. But what happened is that there was this extreme sort of narrative that was built around the fact that ये लोग तो जी पढ़ते ही नहीं है और आप यहाँ पे लाइब्रेरी क्यों बना रहे हो, एंड यहाँ के लड़के पढ़ते थोड़ा है जी, ये तो लाइब्रेरी में जाके भी कुछ उल्टे काम ही करेंगे जी, and all that. And the narrative was so strong that while I was able to resist the idea of not even making the stadium or the community center, in fact, the money that I got allocated for the library was turned around and I was forced to make a community hall there. कि जी चलो इनके शादी ब्याह हो जाएंगे. And then I still kept some amount of money for a smallish library, but even that was shifted out of that slum basti. And I mean, of course, the narrative involved also the fact that people who represent these slum dwellers are not really representatives, and they are not looked down as they are not looked at people as who people can who can represent themselves. They're looked down upon as people who need to be, you know, जिनको एक बंदा देना पड़ेगा हमारे को कि यार यहाँ पे एक अपना बंदा रख दो और वो आपकी बात सुनेगा and हमारे को बताएगा. And so the dialogue that is so essential to democracy, वो dialogue अगर मन में ही ना हो के करना है तो वो मतलब वो I don't know कि वो हो सकता है या नहीं हो सकता. So I saw a bit of that, you know, segregation in of course the residential segregation, as you said, is already happened there. I mean, that's just natural because वो वहाँ पे पहले एक STP होता था, खाली जगह है तो हो गया. But in other senses and in the state coming in, and as Shivangi ji pointed out, the smart city, and we're not a smart city, but whatever, these schemes coming in and we trying to do something. But I think again, matlab, so the interplay of the state and of the narrative as built in is also pretty strong, and that's what I figured out from my sort of way of working here. And it's a question for all of us as to how should we really proceed. I mean, I don't think we can theoretically think like that when we are doing any practice, but that was the question that this is something that troubled me a lot when I was working around this subject. And apart from that, of course, I think a big part of how we run a city is finance commission money. And finance commission money, as you all must be knowing, comes on a per capita basis. Now, if money is allocated on a per capita basis, like really allocated on a per capita basis, then in a slum or in a ghetto or in a basti or whatever, you should be able to spend actually much more money than you spend in the rest of the city, because these are the areas which are very, very highly densely populated. But because there is no sort of normative dialogue around this idea, you know, because this money belongs to like maybe 40% of what is coming to a town like Abohar should be going into a small slum basti. And if that actually starts going, then we may actually be able to turn around the narrative, and whatever you may call it, Disneyization, or you may, there may be very crude infrastructure, but if significant and sufficient infrastructure keeps building up at a place which lacks infrastructure as well, I mean, it might change things. So, I mean, that the first one was just my observation on the theory that you have given in. And of course, I mean, apologies because I've not read the book. I would be very delighted to read it. But second is the question as to should we, I mean, will it lead to more ghettoization or less? I mean, what is your, if there is a norm built around the fact that, let's say, जहाँ पे ज़्यादा लोग हैं वहाँ पे ज़्यादा पैसे खर्चे जाएं within a city also. So, I mean, that's the question to the house or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for these very important observations and couple of great questions. So I'll just take Shivani's question also along with your question, Abhijit ji. And I'll go back to the basics. You know, there are several assumptions that I think are so, commonsensical that we hardly ever challenge them. One of these assumptions is about, what is urbanization itself? The really basic question, what is urbanization? And we have, official definitions of what makes a place urban. And then, of course, we know whether as and when we can categorize a place or a locality as urban, whether there is something urbane about it or not is another thing. Now, as far as, things like concentration of population or what are the economic activity of, such and such percentage of male population of that particular place, and that's how we do this thing. But on the other hand, if we look at it very theoretically, philosophically, what is urbanization? And essentially, if you look at the history of urbanization, starting from, really first urban civilizations like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, or, other such urban civilizations, city-states, then later on, which were the first democratic states, etc. Essentially, urbanization is also a manifestation of a certain form of capital accumulation, whether primitive accumulation or a more modern form of accumulation. Only when do you have a surplus, therefore it goes into infrastructure development. So certain kind of surplus from capital accumulation activities, and of course then in modern nation states, or in earlier when the sovereign kings or emperors were there, they would accumulate certain kind of surplus and then invest that surplus back into building cities or building monuments or other kinds of infrastructure, whether just empty of any actual use, or it was only symbolic, or it was actually something that people had use for in terms of economic use or social use, etc. So this idea of urbanization itself is something that needs to be challenged. And what is it that we are, Shivangi, this is in response to you, that things, the more and more policy kind of innovations, on innovation in quotes, on how should we proceed with further urbanization, are actually, in a way, there is also continuity. So there is this innovation, but there is also continuity, and no scheme of urbanization is ever complete if there is no new form of accumulation which pertains to technological development or other forms of changes that have happened in society. So ultimately, the game in town is capital accumulation. That's the bottom line. Of course, how does it happen? It cannot happen, and I'm coming from a very Marxist point of view, but it cannot happen without exploitation of certain populations, because how do you accrue profit if you don't exploit people for their labor? How do you accrue profit if there is no expropriation of people's labor power or dispossession of certain people or whatever capital, limited capital or limited labor power that they have? So dispossession, expropriation, exploitation in different measures for different groups of people is deployed to do this. Coming to specifically this Abhijit, the question, the dilemmas that you face in terms of administering a particular city or a particular region or area, what I also kept repeating in the talk, and I've written in greater detail in the book, is to understand residential housing segregation and other forms of segregation as essentially labor market segregation. And markets do not function, markets cannot function, and by functioning I mean this whole idea that you have to make profit. How do you make profit if you can't exploit people or exploit labor? And how do you continue to exploit labor if you cannot contain them into the situation where their bargaining power never becomes better? So housing segregation, you will see all kinds of housing segregation, whether based on caste, whether based on class, whether based on linguistic identities or any other identities. There is essentially, in India, labor markets function around caste and kinship and communal networks, right? So if you see, for example, you see around your own locality, and you'll see what I say when, for example, I've noticed in Delhi, most of the plumbers used to be, when I was doing my field work, most of the plumbers used to be Odia people. So they used to come from Odisha, and every time, I called some plumber to my house, and this guy was Odia, and I was thinking, what's happening? But this is how labor markets function in India. You get a job because your chacha, mama, this, that, is already in that job, right? And how much of labor mobility is possible across labor market segment? So let's say, and this is what I meant by choice. So this idea that people self-segregate, या वो तो करते ही नहीं है, वो तो चाहते ही ऐसे हैं, मुसलमान तो रहना ही नहीं चाहते दूसरे लोगों के साथ. Those kind of attitudes about poor people, about Dalits, about Muslims or any other community that is pejorative. The thing is that if an individual wanted to leave a particular segment of labor that he or she was stuck in and move over to another market, how possible is it for them? Depending on their identity, depending on the various other factors, but most important is identity in India, and of course in other parts of the world, is that you cannot make, it takes generations for people to leave one segment of labor market and go on to another segment of labor market, and sometimes even generations won't be enough. So therefore, in my reading, what we are seeing, in terms of neoliberal urbanization as to, disinvestment in public sector jobs and, the opposition to reservation policy is actually an attempt to maintain status quo and not have people have mobility across labor market segments. And when you have, what is the kind of choice that you have? Let's say, for example, I'm giving a very crude example, but let's say if I was a Dalit woman and I had a certain level of, illiteracy / basic literacy, etc., practically illiterate, what kind of choices do I have in terms of, being on the labor market? Essentially, sanitation jobs are 100% reserved for Dalit people, right? Nobody fights for those jobs as well. They are 100% reserved for them, right? And so then what are my choices? I can get a municipality job if I was lucky, but if I wasn't lucky, maybe I can get a cleaning job or some kind of sanitation job in a private office or in somebody's private residence, and so on. Those are my choices. So persons' choices are also existentially limited by their identities. And this opposition, Abhijit, that you shared to establishment of a library in a locality is essentially one of those forces. If you get a library, if you can read, if you can get some kind of education, which also means cultural capital, which also means social capital, then it would enable you to make a jump from one labor market segment to another labor market segment, and nobody wants that, including the government, I'm sorry to say. Because, what are we doing? Officially, we're going to the world and saying, well, here's our demographic dividend. What is our demographic dividend? That we have so many people who are unskilled labor, uneducated, etc. Please come, make in India, exploit us. Right. So this is essentially the processes through which this is happening, and no matter how high tech or how some of these infrastructure that does come up, because if people are not even enabled to use them, or they're not accessible to them, then it's an empty investment of public resources. It never reaches the people that it is supposed to reach. I'm sorry, I already warned you, I speak a lot.
No, please, it was like, it made everything was so intact. Like we could realize how this had worked out, means how it's really beneficial for all of us to understand how things in Abohar as well. Really, thank you. Any other questions? Welcome. Kanchan is there. Yeah, Kanchan, please.
So, Ghazala, I'm not switching on my video because my internet is bad today. But I just wanted to, I read this scholar's work. Her name is Galonia, Juliet Galonia, in Ijur Journal. It's about the segregation of Muslims in Aligarh. And she takes a very different perspective, Like I really was reminded of this whole insider-outsider debate in methodology. So she talks about Muslims self-segregating, the upper class Muslims self-segregating themselves, not only from the Hindus, but also from lower poorer Muslims. So they consciously don't want to live next to the poorer Muslims and to the Hindus. So, I mean, what's your take on this? Like, did you also like come across something like this?
Well, you know, Kanchan, I've already said a little bit about this whole idea of self-segregation when I was talking about choice. So, so in theoretically, you know, everybody has choice to do what they want to do, but existentially, those choices are limited. So even though even Muslims might, you know, say that, well, you know, this is what we want to do, this is what we don't do, we want to be here or we don't want to be there. But the truth is that existentially, we don't know what would happen had they lived in ideal society. You know, in my book, towards the end, I've written a chapter where I'm talking about what are the difficulties in even imagining what an ideal city would look like, where, you know, none of these processes, which to us seem like debilitating for realization of full humanity of anybody, that's happening. Can we even imagine a city where that sort of thing doesn't happen? And so if we were to imagine an ideal city, then we don't know what kind of choices would people have, but essentially people don't have choices, even when they believe they have choices, right? So that's one. But the other thing is that if you look at Muslim neighborhoods are actually different from other neighborhoods in one way. What is that one way? That is that in all other neighborhoods, even though they are segregated, the segregation never cuts across class lines. Okay, so let's say my favorite example is that of, you know, CR Park in Delhi, which is an upper caste, upper class Hindu Bengali neighborhood, right? If you were a poor Bengali, you can't live in CR Park. You wouldn't be able to afford it, right? And if you didn't have a certain kind of cultural capital, even if you accumulated wealth by some means, I'm not going into what those means are. Would you be able to buy a house in a certain locality? No, because markets are not really rational places. Even if you have buying capacity, you can't access all spaces where money, you would think that money can get you into those spaces. No, if you're wearing a sari, you can't go into many pubs and discotheques in Gurgaon, right? Even if you had a lot of money in your pocket. And so it's different spaces demand different kinds of things for being insider, outsider, etc. And money is not the only thing. So, so as far as Muslim neighborhoods are concerned, it is their Muslimness, regardless of their caste, you know, location, regardless of their class location, that actually forces them to be lumped together. Do they like it? No. If they're rich Muslims, they won't like it, right?
Right.
They won't like it. They would hate it. And I live in Zakir Nagar, for example, which is actually one of the posh, in quotes, no comparison with other posh areas of Delhi, but one of the posh Muslim localities. And if you stood, you know, at the entrance of Zakir Nagar in the evening, you would see the most expensive cars that money can buy coming in, but there's parking space is a problem. There's so many other problems. And every day, you know, rich Muslims, yes, are complaining about being forced to live in a Muslim locality, which has, honestly speaking, a lot of problems. And if they were not Muslims, then their money could have gotten them other places. I actually discuss in my book how that happens. Even when you have buying capacity, it is practically impossible to buy property in areas which again are not mixed. So this idea that other places are mixed and they will let you also mix a little bit of Muslims in there, that doesn't happen. So but that aspiration is always there. And I have actually, you know, Christoph Jaffrelot and this Gayer's volume on Muslims in Indian cities, actually, uses this formulation of self-segregation in quite a few chapters. This is Juliet Gilonia's chapter on Aligarh is one of them. But the chapter that they wrote on Delhi on a neighborhood called Abul Fazl Enclave, which is also a upper middle class locality, again says the same thing. So, but the thing is that what they're doing, methodologically, my critique of that work is that what they're doing is that they're not looking at the structural factor, and they are only going and talking to people. And well, rich Muslims are saying, I'm sorry, I hate to be here. I don't want to be here. And then you say, well, they're self-segregating. So they're self-segregating within the larger locality into smaller enclaves, putting up gates. But to any outsider, what do they care if Zakir Nagar and Batla House and Abul Fazl Enclave are actually different from each other? All you can see is Jamia Nagar is a Muslim locality, and it must be therefore dirty, dingy, dangerous, but maybe also a fun place for thrill-seeking adventurer to go and eat some interesting dishes that that they can tell. That's also a certain kind of cultural capital where you can say, I go to places where usually people don't go. So that sort of thing happens. I think what they're explaining in their work is a much more surface kind of description of what is happening. And I mean, I'm bragging a little bit, but what I am doing is to getting into a structural explanation of why it is happening.
All right, thanks, Ghazala.
Thank you so much. We have our last question, Anu. Anu, please.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Ghazala, for a very, very insightful talk. And this was the second time I heard you, when again, so many ideas and thoughts that you've so nicely put together. What I really particularly connected with was the notion of how discourse creates material reality. And I mean, this is more of a comment where I feel that it is so much more important than to create, to especially, let's say, the current discourse around Muslims or Dalits, which is the prominent discourse around. It is so important to create counter narratives and put them out there, so that there can be a shift then in material. It's basically a circular logic. You change the discourse, you change the materiality, and then you change the materiality, you might change the discourse, is what I feel. And I'll leave it at that.
If you had asked me maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I would have completely agreed with you. But I think with the benefit of the experience of last 5-6 years, I've come to a slightly nuanced conclusion, which is that yes, discourses create material realities, and therefore counter-narratives are important to create. Having said that, there is something to be said about brute power of the state and naked violence. So at a particular point of time, I think then discourses on their own are not enough, and some kind of violence is always residual. It's always there. And at that point, all kinds of discourses fail. And we have seen that in, for example, the anti-CA movement and the violence that was inflicted upon the protesters. So the movements move to, settle an alternative discourse. And it's scuttling, not completely, not entirely. So I don't think that it's a complete failure. But still at a point of time when, that kind of naked violence and state power, which renders, it's the state's monopoly over violence, is something that's difficult for even most powerful people. And we see the examples of that every day now in our public sphere, where, somebody or the other that we would have thought, that they couldn't become targets of such violence or such repression do end up becoming targets. So yes, discourses are important, but there's always violence.
Yeah, that's what it's coming to. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ghazla. Any other questions? Yes. Okay. We will really appreciate your appearance here. So we would like to meet you in other conversations as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.